You have a new book coming out, right, with Michael Bernard, who, friend of the Center on Democracy Development and the Rule of Law, actually was a fellow with us on violence and democratic development, which I gather is coming out with Oxford. So Jeff, welcome back to Stanford. It's great to see you.
Up here. Can everybody hear me? Good. I speak loudly anyway. So I wanted to thank Anna and Kathryn for inviting me here to this series. I haven't been to Stanford in a while. Like all of you, I haven't been traveling much in a long time. And so it's really terrific to be on the road a little bit again and to present research. This is, after writing a bunch of books and having basically my dad and my mom buy them, giving them to their friends, I decided, Steve Hansen and I decided to try to write something popular, to try to write something that somebody might buy, accessible. And the story that I'm going to start this with is that Steve Hansen, who's at William and Mary, we had basically the same set of ideas, and you'll see in a second what those ideas were. And we put them down on paper. We have an agent. We sent some chapters off to the agent. And just recently he said, I love this stuff. This is going to be great, but the title is horrible. And so this won't be the title. So maybe one of those things you can do is tell he hates the idea of the good deep state. And you'll see in a minute where I'm going with it. This is where it all started. You know exactly what this is. We were all there. We were sitting in our houses, in our homes, in our apartments, watching television as Donald Trump was there in spring of 2020. And I don't know about you, and I'm not going to trying not to give a political talk here, right? I was angry. I wanted to know where my state was. This is the one circumstance in which I wanted to have a Pentagon level response to this kind of emergency. I wanted to have armies of people delivering food to our houses and masks and eventually this is all pre-vaccine America. And I wanted to know what happened to the state. Now, at the same time as this was happening, as we know, if you're a political scientist, a lot of political scientists started talking about, Anna right here started talking about the kind of democracy and authoritarianism through the populist frame. And my question here is that I want to start with is that frame adequate? And I'm not going to beat up on that frame very much, but I'm going to beat up on it a little bit. So we put down some of our thoughts on paper here. Steve had written something about this in Russia back in 2011. Then we started writing a series of op-eds, and then we have a piece come out in Perspectives on Politics, highlighting the same sets of themes here. And now we've decided to really try to, expand it. And the phenomenon in question is not so much the attack on democracy, as important as that is. It's really something that runs, you could say, orthogonal to it, and that's the attack on the modern administrative state, which is connected to, but I think importantly, conceptually different from the attack on democracy. So here you have this dominant frame. And, some of the people at Stanford, of course, were so important in defining this frame, right? This democratic recession, which is, Freedom House has said democracy's been declining around the world for the last, this was 15 years. It may have reversed this year. I don't know. This has been observed by many, and here's, some names, some of them at Stanford. But the problem is, from the standpoint of the state, regime type is not a very good predictor of public goods provision. You don't have to have a democracy in order to supply clean water, good health, schools, roads, the kinds of things that an economy needs to function. Indeed, a society needs to function. So you have this kind of the dominance of this democracy versus authoritarian frame for thinking about what's been going on in global politics over the last, Anna, 10 years even, maybe something like that. Now, this would have been surprising, this frame, democracy versus dictatorship, before the 20th century. It would have been seen as simplistic. It would not have been the dominant frame that people thought about things. Of course, if you go back to the ancient Greeks, it certainly was not the dominant frame for thinking about things. And one of the things that it does, that framing, is it focuses on really, is rule the rule by a leader or the people, right? And that's one way. How do leaders come to power? Do they come to power based on the consent of the people, or is it inherited, or are they dictators? Do they grab power? And I want to say there's nothing at all wrong with this. But does it capture the phenomenon that I'm trying to explain? The democracy versus autocracy draws our attention to the conditions under which leaders come to power, but not necessarily how rule is carried out. Indeed, Anna wrote a terrific introduction to a series of articles. It was in Polity, right? Where she talked about populism in power. But when she talks about it, it was all about how populist leaders try to stay in power by subverting democracy, as opposed to attacking the very states, attacking the very bureaucracies, the administration, the civil service that they rule over. And that's what I really want to latch onto here. This attempt to deconstruct modern administrative states. That is sometimes called the attack on the deep state, right? And I use that deep state with scare quotes, obviously, because it doesn't exist. But it's a slogan. Where to start? Well, of course, international relations people always understand. They know the questions, but they don't know the answers. Political science comparativists believe they're not sure exactly what the questions are, but they know the answers Weber. Right? That was supposed to be funny. I guess it was funnier back in the day. I've used that for so many years already. But for Weber, rather than the selection of leaders, the key question is obedience to the leader's command. This could occur, he believed, for only very few reasons why you might actually obey. And the most important was what he called legitimacy. Right? You obey because you believe it is your duty to obey. And as you know, many of you know, he thought there were only three possible reasons. And I'm going to concentrate on really two. But the important thing is the key is the link between the leader and his administrative staff or her administrative staff. The link may be highly personal and intimate, and this, of course, characterized the pre-modern era, or it may be impersonal and legalistic, and that characterizes the modern era, what he called legal rational authority. For most of human history, the duty to obey was based on personal relationships. The bond was emotional. It was based on respect, friendship, and devotion. Now, finding a loyal staff isn't easy, Weber pointed out. And so he said, in its purest form, what happens, the leader can only find a staff by, in effect, choosing from family and friends, which he termed patrimonialism. And here is a classic definition. There are several out there, but this kind of puts together, and this is Julia Adams's kind of compilation. Patrimonial regime is a form of legitimate domination in which the ruler and his staff fuse administration with personal authority, considering the state itself to be a family business of sorts. Of course, this might be starting to sound fairly familiar to you, and it doesn't take a genius to see where I'm going with it. Just to highlight legal rational authority. Capitalism for Weber and for a lot of other scholars out there. Capitalism in the military, though, Anna gives us a very important variation on all of this, was really accompanied by the rise of legal rational bureaucracies. That is, the basis of obedience shifts from the person to the abstract set of principles. And with that, you get a professionalized civil service, the rule of law, the role of expertise, eventually public education, and a whole host of other attributes of the state. This, to summarize, made the capitalist West powerful, productive, and mostly pretty safe, depending on which neighborhood and time of the day you're walking in. But you could say at that neighborhood, which is bad, the state is non-existent. The new patrimonials, I want to say, are attacking their own legal rational states. In effect, what we've been experiencing is a demodernization. We've been living through it. The patrimonials harvest the state and they underprovide public goods. Now, it's true that authoritarian leaders, the reason this is important is that authoritarian leaders may govern through remarkably effective bureaucracies, legal rational bureaucracies. And a leader, on the other hand, may be democratically elected, but still seek to legitimate his rule, or her rule, but it's mostly his, it's mostly narcissistic males, to legitimate their rule patrimonially. So that's why I think it's important not to conflate these two things, democracy versus dictatorship versus bureaucracy and patrimonialism. Increasingly, elected leaders have sought to demolish bureaucratic administrative states, which they call deep states. And this deep state rhetoric, it's everywhere. It's not just in the United States. Netanyahu uses it all the time, by the way. All of this suggests we need to provide a second dimension. That's basically the point of this first part of my talk. So, like all political scientists, I have a two-mind, right? And this basically provides the two dimensions. What you can see here, it's simply we talk about democratic versus autocratic, and then bureaucratic versus patrimonial, and then you can start to place states in there. And this was a difficult exercise that I did over the last 2 days. I'm not exactly sure, but I think it captures what's going on there. Obviously, to place Russia, Turkey, and Hungary in this kind of autocratic patrimonial, Hungary is less autocratic than Russia. There's just no doubt about it. The United States is still more bureaucratic in a legal rational sense than the Philippines. And the Danes would probably claim to be more bureaucratic than the Canadians who lived in Canada. And there's a lot of, if you're in Quebec, for example, it's a very corrupt kind of place, right? My wife's from Quebec. I spent a lot of time there. It was more corrupt. My father-in-law was a politician there, and they used to write names off of tombstones, right? So this is a type of place. So that's the basic framework, and I'm happy to be criticized for this. I think this captures something of what we're trying to do here. So how to understand this wave? So earlier studies, this word patrimonialism has been mostly used for the study of Latin America and especially Africa. There's a literature on neo-patrimonialism, which we're not using, and this comes out of modernization theory. And this basically says parts of the developing world, they develop bureaucracies, but because they're not modern, you see the circularity here. Because they're not modern, because they don't have modern orientations, these formally similar bureaucracies don't work the same way. They're all based on personalism, on clientelism, and not the rule of law. But it's our contention that this is not really adequate for understanding the origins of the current wave. You would have expected, if that were true, the current wave to have proceeded from the global south, spreading northward through things like corruption, right? And corruption very broadly understood. But that's not the pattern. The earlier literature, this neo-patrimonialism literature, did not assess the possibility that powerful patrimonial regimes might emerge in consolidated democracies or heavily industrialized societies. And really what we need to do is to look at the unexpected cases of patrimonialism affecting seemingly modern Western nations, such as Britain. I'm going to use Israel because I know something about it, and the United States. So what's the origin story here, right? The origin story is really a story about, it's a story about populism. That's usually what's the way, and there are two variables in the literature on populism as far as I can tell. One is rising inequality that gets people upset, and the changing racial, ethnic, immigration demography in advanced capitalist societies over the past 3 or 4 decades. But why would patrimonial rule have emerged as the powerful political alternative to the administrative state? Why not a political left having taken over rather than a kind of a reactionary right? And for that, to understand that, we need to shift, we argue, from the socioeconomic and demographic structures to the particular roles of political agents. And the starting point for that is this kind of failure of the liberal capitalist model in much of the post-communist world, and especially in post-Soviet Russia, we argue is of critical importance. Yeah. So post-communist Russia. Yeah, because the idea of lecturing Kathryn Stoner about this is insane, but I'll try. So the first place, we are not arguing that the fall of communism from 1989 to 1991 throughout Russia and Eastern Europe did not lead to the liberation of millions of people, right? Gave political freedom, hundreds of millions of people out. But what's true is that, well, everybody believed in minimizing the state and that the state was bad and the market was good. There were a few lonely voices out there saying the problem was not the absence of private markets, which can come about very quickly, and they did, but coherent state bureaucracies carrying out any policy whatsoever. The problem with taking that on, and I'm guilty of this too, I did not, was that if you took it on, you sounded too much like a pro-state person trying to preserve the power of the rent seekers, of the communists, of the deadweight loss proponents, all the literature that came out of that era. And there was nothing wrong per se with that literature, but it did ignore the importance of having a functioning state. And anybody who was in Russia in the 1990s understood that immediately. It was when I had a gun leveled at me on my honeymoon in St. Petersburg that I knew there might have been a small shortage of a state. Now, the process of transition was bound to be disrupted, but this was a free-for-all in Russia. And although it was celebrated in the West, it was indelibly linked with neoliberalism and democracy, with the excesses and theft and the chaos of the 1990s. And this really imprinted itself on the popular imagination. And what happens, and this was a kind of a insight that Steve and I think we had, in the 1990s, Russia faced precisely the same sets of challenges: shrinking blue collar industries, sharply increasing economic equality, weak and unresponsive democratic institutions that would ultimately be perceived as bedeviling our own societies in the West, and of course, other societies in Eastern Europe at the time. So the field was open in Russia for a rejection of liberal democracy, a rejection of liberalism, and a new kind of anti-liberal statism. The question is, what kind? Well, Putin promised, and those were his words, to restore the vertical, the vertical of power, the power vertical. And he set about rebuilding the Russian state, getting rid of his opponents, getting rid of regional strongmen, allowing only oligarchs to keep their wealth, some of them if they agreed to stay out of politics or back his own politics. But over time, the need for legitimacy, the need for some legitimating project forced him back. He chose. It sounds too functionalist that forced him back. He chose to rely on a much older Russian patrimonial tradition. And anybody who's read Richard Pipes's book, this is right. Richard Pipes's books, right, argues this over and over again, right? And it is interesting. I think he is vindicated by Putin's sets of choices. Rule was presented as the culmination of the manifestation of strong power over the course of Russian history. And you had a set of discourses, propositions, which Putin latched onto with ever more conviction. anti-feminism, anti-LGBTQ, hyper-masculinity, that's the one everybody in America knows about, anti-multiculturalism, and ultimately anti-proceduralism and constitutionalism. That happens perhaps last. Pro-family, anti-Muslim, and increasingly Slavophile. And by the time Russia invades Crimea in 2014, Crimea is now pitched as sacred Russian territory. Sacred, the territory is sacrosanct. Now, of course, as you would expect, and Weber anticipates this with patrimonial authority, it's not simply the people follow because they love the person, they're also distributional beneficiaries. And Putin created no shortage of distributional beneficiaries. We maintain that he wasn't really fascist, nor is he fascist now. There's a whole discourse out there about, is Russia fascist? And we can have a discussion about that. It is not a mobilizational regime. It doesn't mean that it's not a dangerous power. It doesn't mean that he hasn't fielded a strong army. He has, but not as strong as he might have liked. And not that he wasn't able to build a state. Patrimonial states are still states. But it is not a fascist state. It is not mobilizational, notwithstanding the kind of bogus imitations of swastikas, the Z's, printed on military equipment. You don't really have the full-on party organization. The organization that does exist in Russia is really a vehicle of corruption more than anything else. So the end result is a failure of liberal democracy and the consolidation of a powerful new patrimonial state in the 21st century. This, I think, is surprising. And, it's been right in front of our eyes for a while, but I think we have to pause and think about that for a moment. Russia abroad. Under different conditions, this might have led to nothing. It might have remained a Russian phenomenon. But Putin pitched his model as a kind of an antidote for failed liberalism. And this would become attractive for opponents of the Western global order, including from within the West itself. And really, the date that I would use to mark this is 2008, which created the perfect conditions for the diffusion of patrimonial ideas and even anti-state building, if you will, in both authoritarian and democratic countries. As Kathryn Stoner points out in her recent book, Putin sought to expand his international influence, not in a traditional way, not in the way that most states do this, but actually from within. And as a traditionalist power, he backed traditionalist parties and movements. There is an ideological affinity. It has to be taken seriously both in Europe and the United States. And increasingly, you get a patrimonial international. It's not simply an authoritarian international. It is one that has a key set of ideas that's not simply tied to restricting the vote, ensuring dictatorship, but also to having a certain kind of state with a certain kind of values and a certain definition of the nation. And so, I spent the first part of my my very first article that actually ever had any traction was about diffusion of democracy from the West to the East. And here I am. That was 1991. Okay. 30 years later, saying it's gone the other way. And so this idea of bad diffusion. That bolded point there. Recall, in the context of legal rational regimes, it's one thing to build a patrimonial state where there are no strong institutions yet. There is no institution in Russia that you can point to today, that you can tell me, a political institution that you can say with 100% certainty that it will be around in 5 years. That's how uninstitutionalized Russia is. Right? Maybe the church, the FSB. It would be called something else. So in a
Why aren't you talking about sheep and finger?
we're coming there. We're coming, and you're going to get to ask that question. I have an idea. It was in the 2x2, and I took it out.
It's the same time frame, same.
Well, let me get.
I will get there.
Okay.
I assure you. I assure you. And if I don't, you can ask. You'll be the first one to ask. Okay. So in a legal rational regime, however, patrimonialism is by definition destructive. It must demolish what already exists. And it must reintroduce the principle of personal loyalty and get rid of procedural state administration. Now, it was easier for Putin to export this model nearer to home, where there were states that state traditions more resembled Russia, and you had a much weaker set of bureaucratic rationalist institutions. I've read a lot of the books on this subject. I'm not sure. I don't think Putin really bought these regimes in any traditional sense. Catherine Belton's book is very good. It's the closest one that comes to saying that. But in each case, Putin assisted patrimonialist parties and movements in candidates and groupings in the hope of creating a world of Putin's. That's, if you want his model for the world, look no farther than the scene in The Godfather when Don Corleone is sitting around with the other Dons around the table. That's the world he wants. That's the world that he's most comfortable with. So, more bad diffusion. So you have the diffusion of this originally to Ukraine, and that was the original deal. Putin was actually would have been okay with Ukraine if this could have been sustained. And what made him mad about Zelensky, what made him mad about previous Ukrainian presidents and candidates who wanted to build, or at least try to build, EU-compliant institutions, was that this would take them out of that patrimonial world. Hungary, of course, and I use Hungary as an example. Poland, it's a little harder to use, but Hungary is a much easier case to use. And it's an interesting one. Exporting this to the EU countries was harder because the EU is essentially a state enlargement, is essentially a state building project. If you followed the process of accession, it was all about constructing states. They were not as concerned. They had the Copenhagen criteria, and I wrote about this too, talking about democracy. But really what they cared about is placing their people in ministries to make sure those ministries operated and that they passed the entire 88,000 pages of the Acquis Communautaire into their own domestic laws. And this was all a state building project. It was harder to do. And this was Orban's project. It's often paid attention to in Hungary that Orban is non-democratic, that he tilts the democratic playing field. And he's done that, there's no doubt. But much less attention is paid to courts, the civil service, and the installation of allies into bureaucratic institutions. Each place that patrimonialism occurs, there's a different sort of formula. The genius of Orban, and anybody who's been there, right, will tell you this, is Orban uses the law. It's all done within a kind of a formal legalism, but hollowed out of its proceduralism. So this was a model for others, right? And, Steve Bannon wanted this to be a model for others, and he tried to take it on the road, and he tried to take it on the road to Italy. Of course, CPAC likes this as well. They had held a conference there. So there's bad diffusion, then there's surprisingly bad diffusion. I start with the case of Israel, because this is really, now you're exporting to countries which had much clearer traditions of legal rational bureaucracy. One of the most surprising things is Netanyahu's own transition from being a normal legal rational bureaucratic proponent. Indeed, the Likud, those of you who know anything about Israel, will know that the corrupt party historically was labor. The non-corrupt, the rule of law, the so-called European Liberal Party was always the Israeli right. They wore suits. They saw themselves as kind of sober and rational. Begin did not disempower the bureaucracy once he came to power in 1977. He did not disempower Israel's Supreme Court in 1977. He insisted that this all be left in place. Even Netanyahu, in his first years, insisted that it be left in place. Over time, however, he too latches on to this same discourse, attacking the police, the judiciary, universities. And what is most shocking, and you can read this, if you read the Jerusalem Post, you don't need to read Hebrew to see this, right? You can see the use of the deep state discussion all the time, right? And he was just reelected, and one of the things he's going to try to do, most important thing, it's the entire reason for his government, is to keep himself from being prosecuted, and he's going to use everything to subvert the Israeli judiciary. Boris Johnson, when he got elected, latched onto the same thing for a while, though it was difficult. And these last two cases are the most difficult cases because this is the kind of erstwhile homeland of the rule of law. Johnson's rhetoric and the whole rhetoric of UKIP was always to attack the EU bureaucracy. And the appointments that he made were mostly based on personal loyalty. And of course, Britain is living with that right now. Rather than competence. Finally, we come to the United States, which is where we started. The evidence here on the patrimonial principle is quite overwhelming. It's quite overwhelming. Everything from the idea of the state as a family business, the difficulty of finding people to appoint. I'm reading the Baker and Glazer book right now on Trump's. I suggest it to everybody. There's not a lot of new there, but it puts it all together. He could not get people to staff his bureaucracies. The number of people who turned him down, right? And I've read I've read the similar memoirs from the Obama and the Clinton era. The number of people to turn him down is completely remarkable. It's not simply that he had to go low down on the list. He ultimately had to turn a lot over to his own family. And the demolition of the state became practice. It almost became a principle. The use of deep state rhetoric, the departure at the State Department of 100 of the most senior diplomats, the moving of the two chief science directorates of the agricultural department to Kansas, may have been good for some people, but mostly not for others. About a third of them quit rather than move to Canvas, and one suspects this was all intentional. Cabinet secretaries appointed who not only disliked policies of their departments, but disliked the existence of the department. And ultimately, the attack on the civil service. And if you want to see the taste of what would happen in 2024, I suggest you read about something called Schedule F, right? Which is the ability of the president to get rid of senior civil servants, if invoked. And of course, public health, which is where we all started. In each country, as I said, the patrimonial coalition is different. The strange thing about the United States, it's this coalition between the patrimonials on the one hand and the libertarians on the other. It's something I never expected. But there are other elements of that as well, too. The Christian nationalists, and of course, those who believe in unlimited executive power, right? And those are the kind of three parts of the American coalition. But in each country, it's slightly different. Last two slides. Who cares? That's always the political science question. Who cares? What's at stake? Well, for me, the big problem is that if you damage the state enough, we don't always need it. I'm not an ideologue of the left. We don't always need it, but we might want it. We might want it, and we might not have it when we need it. It may go misdiagnosed. Leaders can remain in power for a while, and they can harvest existing state capacities, something along is there a word for it? Like social capital is sometimes used for society. It's built up existing state capacities which don't always get used, using residual expertise and capacity, as in the United States, and Trump was using that. Built up from previous eras. Netanyahu used it for a long time. And this makes the damage less obvious to supporters. We may misunderstand patrimonialism as authoritarianism or authoritarian populism. We won't recognize the malign effects that can emerge in both regimes. And Alvin, that's where it could emerge. I will come back to this in Q&A. That China does not easily fit in those boxes, but it is on its way to the danger. It is on its way to patrimonial. It was not. It had a Leninist effective state that substituted. And here I go back to my own graduate school. It's like Ken Jowett talked about the historical substitute to the Western bureaucratic state was for a while the Leninist state, and China did have that. But I'll come back to this. In the end, the damaging effects of patrimonial rule will undermine the integrity of electoral procedures. That's where the connection between democracy and patrimonialism comes in, is that democracy requires the procedural state. But the connection is indirect. I want to say it's something, the entire rationale for this book depends on it being something different, and I think it is. And we can't operate that way for very long. Sometimes you get lucky. I think we just got unlucky for a while. Our first meeting in 2 years, we got unlucky. Let me skip to the third point, because it's really the point. Why are we arguing this? We need a renewed appreciation, not only for democracy, but also for the state. A state that's deeply embedded, impersonal, and valued in our culture, one that provides public goods without which we can't survive as a species. Americans love to hate the state, but if the history of Europe shows us anything, is that this state-building project, it's contingent. It's not easy. I mean, I wrote all those pages, right, about how an unlikely set of coalitions came about to produce, ultimately, the states that we recognize. It may be harder to put them back into place once we demolish them. And so we argue for the importance of the good deep state. I'm fully aware of the critiques of the state from the right. Fully aware. Indeed, my first book on East Germany was essentially a Hayekian analysis of planning, right? But Hayek was a gradualist. He believed in emergent order. And deconstructing something by human will, he also, I believe, would have opposed in the way that the enemies of the current state, opponents of the current state would wish to do. And I'm also aware of the critique of the left. The critique of the left is also an interesting one. It is that this division between politics and administration should be overcome, because really, at the end of the day, administration is all political, so why not just acknowledge it anyway? Sometimes when I read those people, I say, and this, these are colleagues of mine, I said, have you people never read Lenin? Right? You can't actually just you do that, because if you do that, you're going to actually need administration. And if you think you can collapse administration into politics, what you're going to end up with is simply another form of tyranny. So at the end of the day, what we're calling for is a very moderate and modest set of acknowledgments for the importance of the state and the true danger that's faced. And that's not simply the prospect of never having free and fair elections again, as bad as that is, but also not having the very organizations that made modernity not only desirable, but tolerable. And that's how I'll end my talk. And I'm happy to take any questions you might have.
So I was going to, yes, I'm just any questions. And Jeff has already reserved Alvin as the first one, and then Kathryn, you're next, I promise.
Yeah, you've got to speak, or the people on the watching from abroad.
Okay. So, where to start? North Korea from day one. And then Xi Jinping used to be a collective 7-member standing committee, the Central Committee. Now it's rule of one, and what he says goes. God, how many African dictators that were around for 40 years who had pretenses of election, but none of it mattered for squat until they were either overthrown or shot or died off. So when you're talking about comparative analysis, and a core statement in it is individual variety country to country, you're killing off comparative politics as a field in which, as you know, all of political science wants to have models and difference equations and statistics. So 8 cases in an anecdote, 3 cases is a trend. 100 cases lends itself to an econometric complexity that defies anything we thought possible 30 years ago. And but at the end of the day, historians found 240 reasons for the fall of Rome. 400 books were written on the causes and consequences of the crash in 2008. When I began political science in the 60s, we used to rely on the historical descriptive methods that got bad names. So the real question is, when you go with this, and I'll conclude with just comments on Israel, where I won 20 times, I know all these people. Netanyahu has been under attack by his own judicial system over and over, and the police. I met these judges. I've been to their universities. If you think the faculties here are 90% Democratic, they're 98% Netanyahu. The newspapers, my God, maybe there's a piece of one that isn't. But I would say the Never Trump movement pales against the Never Netanyahu movement. And one can understand how he couldn't use any of the ordinary institution of Israeli society. And so at the end of the day, I remember meeting Israel Kassar of the old Labor Party way back when. That was it. Bapam, the Labor Party, it's dead. 4 seats. Anyway, I'll stop at that point. But, you know, I've opened up a whole Pandora's box. Go where you want. A whole course.
Okay. Thanks so much for the reactions. I'm not so much trying to build. I mean, it does sound like what I've done, that I'm giving this kind of one single model of here is how the world developed over the last 2 decades. And it's kind of, you know, it's kind of, instead of out of Africa, it's out of Russia, right? And I don't doubt that there are other forces at work. No doubt, right? But I think that the kinds of things that I talked about here, I don't think it's that surprising to anybody. I think what we've done is we've put together, right, kind of some social theory with some historical description in order to make sense of both of what just happened and what I think the real danger is. The real danger, it's not simply about African dictators or even an American dictator, as bad as that would be. I think that the real danger is to the attack upon the state itself. And yes, Netanyahu faced opposition from the press, although the Israeli press has probably changed a bit since you were reading it, and certainly faces a lot of opposition from the universities. But that's precisely why he's attacking his own judiciary, right? Why they're talking about, and this is, it makes it somewhat related to the American project, bringing in the religious nationalists. And what they want more than anything is the introduction into civil law of halakha, of Israeli religious law, right? And that is a lot like the American Christian nationalist project, right? I mean, the content is different, but formally it looks pretty similar.
They loan.
Yes, they're not in Israel, but what I would
Their mindset when it comes to
I understand. And China, I couldn't agree more. Originally, China was up there in and had a question mark beside it. I said, okay, you're going to Stanford. You got to take out the question marks. You're certain. So then I took out China, right? You know, I took out China because I'm still not sure China does have this huge residual reservoir of a kind of viable Leninist state. But it appears to be, to use the Weberianism, to be routinizing in a patrimonial direction. I would agree with you completely, right? That's all the arrows are sort of pointing in that direction right now. So that's my little reaction.
Kathryn?
Okay, super interesting. Thank you, Anna. Super interesting, Jeff. I have a couple of reactions. So one question, as you were talking about Putin trying to diffuse this model, he's certainly trying to diffuse Russian influence. Why would it be in his interest to diffuse this model? Before you answer, because he has eroded the capacity of the state. Russia has sort of spotty state capacity, and he needs a myth of competence as well to maintain his regime. And what we're seeing is the erosion of state capacity. We're seeing a full display with the Russian military currently, and with the mobilization of soldiers, right? And the sort of dizzy with success thing that, right? So this myth of competence, and that's actually the paper I'm going to give at ASSIS that we're both going to. I'll give it to you. Is about this, right? Has made him vulnerable. Now, not that he's at risk of falling immediately, but he doesn't look very competent. He doesn't look worth emulating currently, and he's got to use more and more force. And now it's a repressive form of authoritarianism because the regime can't handle the commitments, basically, that it's made on behalf of this weak state. And patrimonial. It's corrupt. It's incompetent. So if you're thinking, since you invoked everyone but, and it's too bad Frank Fukuyama's not here. He's traveling because he'd love this. Everyone but Huntington, right? And so you could get into a situation here, and you will, where where social demands overwhelm what the state can actually do, because you've done all these things to it. It's corrupt. It can't implement policy. It can't tax. It can't spend, and so you get political decay, and you get the end of whatever these regimes are, weak democracies, autocracies. So yeah, and why would he want to diffuse it as well? It's not working very well.
It's a hugely important question. The model, as you were speaking, the model that you were kind of articulating really well was this idea of the competent dictator, right? And like Treisman and Guriev, their book, and you've talked about this too, right? It's kind of this competent dictator, and I don't doubt that that's part of what's going on, but I think what this points us to is his move in a traditionalist direction. That is he actually competent at preserving, defending, protecting, promoting these traditional values, which a lot of Russians share. A lot of Russians share. Now, you're right. I mean, if things get bad enough, and there's no food, it goes back to waiting in line for toilet paper, like we both did in the old Soviet Union. Yeah, that would probably be bad. There's no sign of that yet, really. And so what he's exporting, I think you have to take these patrimonial ideas, these kind of traditionalist ideas, the traditionalist view of the nation. I think we have to take them seriously. It's not simply about goodies, though goodies follow. And it also, of course, helped Putin greatly that he comes to power at a time of increasing. I mean, you write this too, increasing petroleum prices, which gives gigantic resources to the Russian state. I remember when I was director of the Center for European, Russian, and Eurasian Studies at Toronto, for years in the 90s, the Russians would come in and said, "Would you like to have exchange?" And he said, "Yes, of course." And they said, "Well, you'll pay for yours to come to us, and you'll pay for us to come to you." And we'd say, "Well, no, it can't really work that way." So finally, in about 2002, they came and they said, "We want to have exchange." And I said, "Okay, but we don't have any money for you." And they finally said, "We don't want your money." Exactly. Yeah. And that helped. That helped. But that gave Putin a lot of the genius of Putin is he took that moment that you've talked about, that others have talked about, and bootstrapped it into this traditionalist power. Now, can he do anything he wants with it? No. I mean, we're now discovering he doesn't have the army that he thought he had. But does great powers, and this is, sounding less like Huntington, like Kissinger, I suppose, that great powers tend to have a foreign policy that reflects their own models, their interests are defined by their values, right? And so I don't think you can look at it purely in a kind of a raw dollars and cents way. Yeah, the Russian state, it's true. The Russian state is not competent. It's not the French state. It's not the German state. You know, in the 19th century, Russia couldn't carry out a proper census, right? And yet it still built itself. Actually, it's,
1897.
it is.
Anywhere.
It is. But if you read, there's a set of books by this guy. He's a conservative historian, and Russian historian, and these are brilliant books. I don't agree with much of what he says, but he talks about how in the first part of the 19th century, they didn't even know the names of the places, right? Forget about how many people lived there. So I agree with you. They catch up, but this is all kind of bootstrapped based on a patrimonial model. It is not based on a Western model. And so that's all I would say back to you, Kathryn, that I think what you're saying is very important, that there could come a point when if Putin can't produce the goodies, who needs them anymore? But it's not just that, right? It's far more complex than that, right?
We'll talk after, but I think I have to.
Okay, rejoin.
Next, we have Norman.
Okay, just parenthetically, I think you're misreading the 19th century and overwhelmed with pipes. I mean, really, there's a real argument among historians and a real critique of how he analyzes Imperial Russia.
Yes.
Okay, so I think what you say is does not make sense for the 19th century when Russia had one of the most advanced legal systems, competent bureaucracies, and so on in all of Europe. So I would back off of that a little bit.
Boris Mironov.
Yeah,
that's what I'm talking about. That's
but that again, the 1897 census was a brilliant census. Anyway, that was not my question. My question had to do, I want you to speak a little bit more about this diffusion question. That is to say, what causes what and who initiates what. And then, it goes back a little bit to Alvin's question too. I would hypothesize that the world is changing. In other words, that the international system is changing. The way we're dealing with, modernity is changing, or postmodernity is changing everywhere. Yeah. So obviously Putin is supporting this kind of patrimonial idea. All over. But is that really? Is that a cause? Of the changes, or is it just a kind of dynamic within the changes that are going on in our own country and elsewhere?
If this were a job talk, I would say you're completely wrong. You don't know what you're talking about, right? I'm right and you're wrong, and I'm the center of everything. And so, but I'm not. I'm not going to do that. So it's interesting that you brought up the diffusion idea, because my wife's also my wife's a political theorist, and I told her a million times what I'm doing, and she said, "Why even use the word diffusion? It's not really about diffusion at all. Things appear to be kind of happening in different places. Similar things are happening in different places. The mechanism of diffusion is not really there, and it's certainly not the mechanism that you defined when you talked about diffusion from west to east in 1991 in world politics, where it was all about EU institutions and money and investment and all that kind of thing. It's a different set of phenomena. So that's the kind of intellectual striptease. You're right? However, it's not for lack of trying. It's not for lack of trying. The Russians have been trying, right? They've been trying in various places. And I don't think we should kind of underestimate. There's a reason why. And we'll find out that reason someday, right? There is a reason why Trump won't criticize Putin. And it has to do, I think, more than anything else, with it's not just about money. It's not just about building a hotel in Moscow, right? It's about kind of an elective affinity, a Wahlverwandtschaft, right? An elective affinity between the way these two people think about the world. Putin was first. It came out of there, right? And the way the articulated model that eventually gets put on the ground in the United States, I think it was affected by this. Is it the only thing? Absolutely not. The United States has an independent history, right? Your question about the kind of the status of the causal explanation, I don't know. I can't really give you a firm answer to that. I think there is a causal effect. I'm pretty sure there's a causal effect. I can't nail it down. It's not that kind of study. I haven't spent time in the archives. Don't have the letters, right? I don't have the transcripts. We don't know what Putin and to this day, we don't know what they talked about in Helsinki for 2 hours and nobody present. Translator, but even the translator has not given a coherent explanation of what was there, right? And so we don't really know what was going on in that room. I assume it was not a whole lot, because that's the nature of talking to Trump, right? There's a lot of blah, 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 not a lot of substance. But I think there was this elective affinity. There's certainly an elective affinity with Orban. And there was certainly an elective affinity with Yanukovych, even stronger. And I haven't talked about Erdogan. Right. And that's maybe it's elective affinities. I don't think that's going to go anywhere on the title of the book. Well, there's a play, I think, called Elective Affinities, if I remember correctly.
I think we're running out of time for our Zoom audience, but I still wanted to take the opportunity to ask you a question.
Please.
So Norman went after you with diffusion. I totally agree with him. I'm going to go after you with democracy, because you claim that there are these sort of patrimonial democracies, and as examples you use the United States, Brazil, and Philippines. But in all of those cases, it's profoundly anti-democratic actors who are attempting to install this neo-patrimonial style of governance. So this is a very much non-democratic project. It just happens to be that in those cases, the democratic state has managed to withstand the assault. But the people who are responsible for this, like whether it's Trump or or Duterte or Bolsonaro, are all profoundly anti-democratic, and this just means to that end.
It's a good question. The way I would respond to that is say that so far, what we have, let's use the actors that you've talked about. It's true that Trump did not want to leave office, and he wasn't going. If January 6th would have succeeded, he wouldn't have left office. He was truly an authoritarian who was forced to leave office. He would not have. The case of Brazil is an interesting one. He was using authoritarian means while he was ruling in order not to get unelected, but he did lose the election and he left office, right? So what are we supposed to say about this? He was not authoritarian enough, right? That obviously was not the most important thing to him. You want to argue?
How about the state stymied him, right? Trump was eventually stymied. So was Bolsonaro. It was made clear to him that there's enough, basically the state was resilient enough that it would push back against it.
Right. Now I agree. The state was there, and these two projects are sort of connected to each other, but they're not necessarily the same thing, right? I think the danger is slightly different. You could have, let me give you an example, hypothetical. You could have an authoritarian patrimonial ruler who we would agree is authoritarian, who's an aspiring authoritarian, comes to power, spends 4 or 8 years wrecking his own state, and then leaves office. And what you're left with is a new democratic ruler who's replaced this person with a wrecked bureaucracy. I'd argue that under certain circumstances, the danger that I'm pointing to is more important than the danger you're pointing to, even though those two things, that period of wrecking by this authoritarian patrimonial, was collinear, was coterminous, right? It's a different dimension of the same era. Do
you have any further questions? Yeah. Oh, there's one more question. Oh,
I said Christian.
Christian, okay. Go ahead.
Hi, I'm Ondra. I'm from Mongolia. but a very fascinating topic. And I was a lawmaker in Mongolia in the parliament. Plus, I worked in the executive branch as ambassador in charge of nuclear security issues. And what's fascinating to me both is somebody who served for the state, but somebody who's now trying to understand what it is to govern and how important the bureaucracy is and competency within the bureaucracy is. And I'm watching the effect of the events within Russia to the neighboring countries. And I'm so impressed with, well, maybe impressed is not the right word, but I'm watching closely how, for example, Kazakhstan is doing. And as you saw, Mr. Tokayev, when he came to office, many people kind of tried to predict how he will undo what Mr. Nazarbayev did for a long time, and voluntarily giving up some of his power, transitioning to parliamentary democracy as opposed to presidential democracy. How would you categorize? But some people are saying Kazakh success may be very superficial, and for example, corruption is still very strong. Clientelism is still very strong. Where would you put Kazakh in your matrix, for example?
Yeah. So this is this 2x2 question. The important thing, I mean, let me just say, these types that I've used from Weber, these are ideal types, right? In the sense, not in the sense of being good, but in the sense of being pure types. They don't actually really exist in their pure form everywhere. And Weber himself noted that the United States was full of patrimonial, when he talked about machine politics in the United States. And then, of course, he points to bureaucracy in ancient Egypt, right? So the question is what type dominates? What it dominates? So, I mean, from the standpoint of this crude 2x2, they would all be in the same box. They would be in the patrimonial, right, authoritarian box. Are they moving towards some place? Do they edge towards the other boxes? Yes, right. And that's when you act. Now, my problem, what I know about Kazakhstan, you could fit on my fingernail. And so some things I don't feel confident speaking about, and that's certainly one of them.
The mark of a truly mature. Final word goes to Christian, and then we will end.